Some Protestants who align with a believers-only baptism will argue against infant baptism using the rationale that it wasn't a teaching of the apostles. Well, how can you defend against this? Well, first we look to the first century and the New Testament, and we must admit that infant baptism is not mentioned. But don't be worried by this, though, as we read in Acts that whole households were baptized, and it seems highly unlikely that there were never any infants in a household. So I believe that although we have the more reasonable and probable argument, to be fair, infant baptism can't be explicitly proven or disproven by using just the New Testament. So does the second century give us any clues what the apostles believed? Again, we have silence for most of the century as no one even discusses infant baptism, accepting or opposing, until 189 AD when Irenaeus writes that baptism is spiritually regenerative, causing a person to be reborn in God, and that infants are included. Aha, they conclude. Since it took 90 years after the apostles to first talk about infant baptism, that proves it was not taught by the apostles. But don't panic, as silence does not mean opposition or that infant baptism didn't occur much earlier. Here's why. We read from Hippolytus in 215 AD, explicitly stating to baptize infants who can't speak for themselves. Origen in 248 AD goes as far as to say infant baptism was received by the apostles. They are only a few generations after the apostles when they said this. And you know what we don't see when they make these claims? Opposition. No warning against baptizing infants or that baptism should only be for those who can profess faith. Well, why is that? The obvious answer is because infant baptism wasn't something new. Why do I say that? Because it's not like the early church was shy about calling out something it thought was wrong. We can look at the strong and public opposition against abortion and contraception, rebaptism, invalid baptism, and many heresies. The church always spoke out against controversial beliefs, and yet no mention of opposition to infant baptism. Why? Because the belief was widespread, taken for granted, uncontroversial, and appealed to apostolic tradition. That's why the early silence. The last argument that you will hear is that in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the norm was to delay baptism into adulthood, making it sound like infant baptism wasn't believed. Baptism was delayed exclusively due to the benefits of baptism forgiving all sins, some of which could be mortal sins committed by adults. It had nothing to do with the lack of belief in the benefits of infant baptism. In fact, infant baptism was the universal norm from 400 AD to well after the founding of Protestantism, when even Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin all believed in infant baptism. And as the Catholic Church still teaches, that baptism saves infants. May God bless you in defending infant baptism.